Ethan Miller had never imagined that owning the top-floor apartment of a modest Chicago brownstone would come with anything other than peace and the occasional leak from the ancient plumbing. The building was old, the kind of structure that carried the weight of decades in its bricks, with stairwells that groaned under every footstep and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up from the lake. Still, what had attracted Ethan most when he bought the place 3 years earlier was the access to the flat roof above his unit. The deed clearly stated that the rooftop space was tied exclusively to his apartment, a feature that allowed him to build a simple terrace where he could retreat from the crowded streets below. He had put money into making it livable. Wooden decking laid carefully by contractors, a couple of loungers where he could sit and read in the summer evenings, and a few large planters with hardy succulents that could survive the brutal Midwest winters. It was not extravagant, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could drink coffee at sunrise or watch the city lights flicker on at dusk. That sanctuary began to shift in the strangest way possible, one ordinary Thursday. Ethan had spent the day at work, a long string of meetings that left him drained, and as he climbed the creaking stairs toward his apartment, he noticed a faint earthy smell drifting down from the top. At first he thought little of it. Perhaps one of the neighbors had burned incense or cooked something strong, but when he unlocked his door and stepped inside, the scent was even sharper. It wasn't cooking or perfume. It was soil, fresh, damp soil, the kind that clings to the air after rain. Curious and slightly unsettled, Ethan climbed the narrow staircase that led directly to the rooftop terrace. He expected to find perhaps a leak in one of the planters or maybe some mess left by birds, but the sight that met him stopped him cold. Lined neatly across the far end of his deck were 3 wooden crates, each filled to the brim with dark earth. Small green shoots were already poking through the surface, tender stems that seemed to have been planted days earlier. The crates themselves were sturdy, not something hastily thrown together, and they sat squarely on his decking as though they belonged. Ethan stood there for a long moment, waiting for his brain to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. No one had permission to be here. The rooftop was locked from the stairwell, and only his key opened it. Yet someone had not only entered but had taken the time to install full garden boxes. At first, his reaction was almost comical disbelief, the kind of stunned amusement that comes when life suddenly veers into absurdity. He even laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if it were all a prank. Maybe the building super had confused his unit with someone else's, or perhaps a local gardening group had made an outrageous mistake. But when he knelt down to touch the soil, he felt the weight of intention in the act. This was not a mistake. Someone had carried heavy bags of dirt up several flights of stairs, hauled wood, assembled boxes, and carefully planted vegetables. Tiny plastic markers labeled the rows: basil, cherry tomato, kale. It was as deliberate as it was invasive. The following morning, the mystery deepened. Ethan returned to the roof with his coffee, hoping to reassure himself that perhaps he had imagined it, or that the crates might already have been removed. Instead, he found a middle-aged woman in a sun hat standing proudly beside them, watering the soil with a plastic jug. She looked so at ease that for a split second, he wondered if he had stepped into someone else's world, like a trespasser in his own home. When she turned and smiled, the lines of her face creasing with warmth that felt oddly rehearsed, she greeted him as though they had met before. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a cheerfulness that rang false. "I hope you don't mind. This space was simply begging for some life, and I thought it would be such a shame to leave it barren." Ethan's mouth went dry. He recognized her vaguely. Karen, a woman who lived 2 floors below, known mostly for her loud phone calls in the hallway and her habit of pinning passive-aggressive notes to the bulletin board near the mailboxes. She wasn't a stranger, but she certainly wasn't a friend, and she had absolutely no right to be on his roof. He opened his mouth to object, but before he could find the words, she continued, waving her hand toward the seedlings as if presenting a gift. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. You won't have to lift a finger. By summer, we'll have fresh herbs and vegetables right here. Isn't that wonderful?" For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, unable to decide whether to laugh, shout, or demand an explanation. It wasn't just the audacity of her action, it was the casual certainty in her tone, the way she spoke as though this were already a shared project, as though his ownership and consent were irrelevant details. In that instant, the sanctuary he had built for himself no longer felt private. It felt invaded, claimed by someone who had no hesitation in rewriting the rules to suit her own desires. And as Karen bent back down to adjust the soil, humming softly as though she were in her own backyard, Ethan understood with a slow, sinking clarity that this was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. This was the beginning of something much larger, something that would test not only his patience but his grip on the very space he called home. Ethan had dealt with eccentric neighbors before, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer persistence of Karen once she had planted herself, quite literally, on his roof. The morning he first confronted her had ended in awkward civility. He managed to tell her that the rooftop was his private property, purchased along with his apartment, and that she needed to remove the crates. She only smiled in that slightly patronizing way, as if he were an impatient child being humored by an adult, and said that he must have misunderstood, that the roof belonged to everyone in the building, not just him. Ethan tried to correct her, pointing out the deed and the clear legal language, but Karen dismissed it with a wave of her hand and the infuriating remark, "You should read the newer guidelines, dear. The city encourages shared green initiatives." Then she returned to her watering can as though the conversation were already finished. That night, Ethan reread his deed 3 times, searching for any loophole he might have missed. The language was clear and unequivocal. Exclusive rights to the roof terrace were assigned to his apartment alone. He even dug through his old mortgage paperwork just to be sure he was not imagining things. Everything confirmed what he already knew. He was right. Yet when he returned to the roof the next day, he discovered that the 3 planters had doubled to 6, and now included not only leafy greens but climbing poles for beans. Karen, wearing gardening gloves and a look of triumphant satisfaction, greeted him with a chirpy, "Good afternoon. Look how fast it's all coming along." She acted as though his presence were incidental, like he was wandering into her project, not the other way around. Ethan tried again, more firmly this time, telling her she had to remove her things. Her response was to tilt her head, smile thinly, and ask, "Do you really want to be the person who kills a garden? In this city, where we desperately need green space, fresh air, and local produce? It would be such a shame for everyone if you insisted on being difficult." The way she lingered on the word difficult made his skin prickle. She wasn't asking for permission. She was announcing that she had already claimed the space, and any resistance on his part would be cast as hostility, selfishness, even cruelty. In the days that followed, Ethan began to realize that Karen was no longer just dabbling in a quirky hobby but constructing an entire narrative. Neighbors in the building started making casual comments when they saw him in the hallway. Remarks like, "Karen says the rooftop garden looks amazing, already." Or, "It's so great you agreed to share the space. It's going to help the whole building." Each time, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't agreed to anything, but Karen was telling people that he had, rewriting reality one conversation at a time until the story of the community garden became the accepted truth. One evening, when he came home late, Ethan noticed shadows moving above and heard the scrape of wood on wood. When he climbed the last staircase, he found 2 younger volunteers, people he didn't recognize, hauling bags of soil up to the roof. Karen was orchestrating the scene like a foreman, pointing to where they should place the new crates and praising their effort. Ethan demanded to know what they were doing. Karen answered sweetly, "Don't worry, they're just helping out. We have so many plants to get in the ground before the season really starts. You'll thank me when you see how beautiful it all looks." Then she turned back to the volunteers and said loudly, "Don't mind him. He's still adjusting. That remark landed like a slap. Adjusting. As though he were the unreasonable one, clinging to a fantasy of ownership in a world that had moved on. Ethan felt his pulse in his throat, but the sheer brazenness of her performance left him stunned into silence. By the time he gathered himself to argue, the volunteers had already unloaded their supplies, and Karen was chatting merrily about composting methods, acting as though his words had never been spoken. What unsettled Ethan even more was the precision with which Karen defended her position. When he told her yet again that the rooftop was his property, she produced a stack of papers, photocopies of city pamphlets about green initiatives, outdated building regulations that mentioned communal access to unallocated roof areas. Even clippings from newspaper articles about urban agriculture. None of it applied directly to his situation, but she brandished them as though they were irrefutable proof. "See," she said, tapping a page for emphasis, "the city wants us to do this. They expect residents to work together. If you fight me, you're really fighting the environment. Do you want to be the man who stands against progress?" The manipulation was so transparent, yet disturbingly effective. Ethan could already feel the tide of public opinion shifting in the building, neighbors smiling at Karen and thanking her for her hard work, some even offering to donate pots or seeds. Meanwhile, his own protest sounded even to himself defensive and mean-spirited, as though he were picking a fight over plants instead of trying to defend his legal rights. The breaking point came one Saturday morning when Ethan opened his door to find a small basket of freshly cut herbs on his welcome mat. A handwritten note, signed with a flourish by Karen, read, "From our garden. Enjoy." Isn't it wonderful to be part of something bigger than ourselves? The arrogance of that "our" made his hands shake. He hadn't planted a single seed, yet Karen had already declared joint ownership, even though she knew perfectly well it was his roof. Later that same day, when he confronted her and demanded that she stop bringing strangers into his space, she leaned in close, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, and whispered, "You don't understand, Ethan. This is bigger than you. I'm not going anywhere. You can yell, you can stomp, but in the end, the garden will grow, and people will love it. If you try to fight that, you'll be the villain. Are you ready to be hated by everyone in your own building?" Then she straightened, smiling broadly once more, and called out cheerfully to a passing neighbor about how wonderful the basil smelled. It was at that moment, watching her slip effortlessly from quiet threat to sunny charm, that Ethan realized he was facing something far more insidious than a boundary dispute. Karen wasn't just planting vegetables. She was planting a narrative, cultivating it as carefully as her rows of tomatoes, ensuring that by the time he gathered the courage to uproot it, it would already have taken root in the minds of everyone around him. And as much as the crates and soil and seedlings enraged him, what terrified Ethan more was the growing sense that she was right about one thing. Once the garden became a symbol, no one would care whose roof it was. By the third week, the rooftop no longer resembled the quiet terrace Ethan had built for himself. It looked like the beginnings of a small farm clinging to the top of an old brick building. The wooden decking he had carefully chosen and paid for was almost completely hidden under planters, trellises, watering cans, plastic buckets filled with compost, and clusters of seedlings in repurposed yogurt containers. Where once there had been space to stretch out with a book or watch the skyline, now there were narrow pathways carved between rows of plants, and everywhere he stepped his shoes picked up stray soil. What unsettled him even more than the physical invasion was the sense that Karen had created a new order of ownership, one in which he, the actual legal owner, was recast as a reluctant participant rather than the authority. When he tried to reclaim the space, her response was always to drown his protests in the language of community, sustainability, and shared benefit, words that made him sound petty if he dared to resist. The first real escalation came when Ethan returned home one evening to find the lock on the rooftop door had been changed. His key no longer worked. For several minutes he stood in the stairwell, rattling the knob in disbelief, until the door finally swung open from the other side and Karen appeared, her sun hat tilted jauntily, as though she were welcoming him into her greenhouse. "Oh, Ethan, there you are," she said brightly, ignoring the fact that he had clearly been locked out. "I had the lock adjusted for safety reasons. We can't have just anyone wandering in here." "Don't worry, I'll get you a copy of the new key." The implication was clear. She had taken control of access to his own property, and now he was a guest waiting for her permission to enter. He tried to confront her right then, demanding to know by what authority she had touched the lock, but she responded with a breezy explanation about insurance concerns and liability, as though she were doing him a favor by securing the space. Word spread quickly among the tenants that Karen was managing the garden, and soon Ethan noticed that when he walked through the lobby, people greeted him with comments that carried a faint edge of accusation. "Karen says you're not really into the gardening yet, but give it time," one neighbor said with a knowing smile. Another mentioned that she had already organized a schedule for watering shifts and that he should pick a day. Ethan stood there, stunned that she was assigning duties on his behalf, as though he were another volunteer rather than the sole owner of the land beneath their feet. When he tried to correct the narrative, telling people the roof was his and not a community lot, the looks he received ranged from awkward disbelief to thinly veiled irritation. The more he insisted, the more it seemed he was reinforcing Karen's version of the story, that he was selfish, obstinate, unwilling to share. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Ethan discovered a printed flyer taped to the mailboxes in the lobby. It was decorated with cheerful illustrations of tomatoes and sunflowers and read in bold letters, "Rooftop Garden Project, bringing our building together." At the bottom was Karen's name and phone number, with a note encouraging residents to stop by and participate. No mention was made of Ethan, the actual owner. His hands shook as he tore one of the flyers down, only to realize that half a dozen others were scattered across the neighborhood bulletin board, at the laundromat down the street, and even taped to a lamppost on the corner. Karen had not only occupied his roof but had broadcast its existence to strangers in the community, effectively inviting the city into his private space without a shred of his consent. When he confronted her about the flyers, she affected a tone of innocence that was almost convincing. "Oh, come on, Ethan. It's just a little publicity." People love hearing about local gardens, and, besides, it reflects well on all of us. You'll be proud when the neighborhood paper does a story he could barely find words, choking on the fury that rose in his chest because how could he argue without sounding like the villain she had already painted him to be? Every time he tried to assert his rights, she reframed the conversation as a moral choice. Either he supported the garden and was part of something good, or he destroyed it and revealed himself as heartless. The tension in the building grew sharper with each passing week. Some neighbors began leaving small notes at his door, thanking him for allowing the garden and promising to contribute supplies. Others hinted less politely, asking whether he planned to demand rent from Karen or if he was just going to let her do all the work. Ethan realized with a sick twist in his stomach that the narrative had shifted entirely. People now assumed that he had granted her permission and that any objection from him would be seen as betrayal. He had been cornered not by law, but by perception, and perception was quickly becoming more powerful than truth. It was during one particularly heated argument on the rooftop, after he had found a group of strangers lounging in lawn chairs among the tomatoes, that Karen revealed the full extent of her confidence. When Ethan demanded that the guests leave, she folded her arms and said in a calm, deliberate voice, "You need to accept that this space doesn't belong only to you anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes in what we're doing. You may have the paperwork, but I have the people, and people are what matter." Her words hit him with the force of a threat wrapped in philosophy. She was openly declaring that she had stripped him of practical ownership, and that the documents he clung to were meaningless compared to the reality she was manufacturing day by day. That night Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to faint footsteps above him as Karen tended to her plants long past midnight. Each scrape of a crate, each splash of water, was a reminder that his home had been invaded not by burglars or vandals, but by an ideology that dressed itself in innocence. He understood then that this was no longer a misunderstanding or a petty squabble. This was the first escalation in a battle for control, one that would not be won by shouting in hallways or waving a deed in someone's face. Karen was building a fortress of perception around herself, and if he didn't act soon, the fortress would harden into fact. Ethan had never been the type to think of himself as strategic. Yet as the weeks passed and the garden on his rooftop expanded like a slow-moving invasion, he realized that confronting Karen head-on was a mistake. Every outburst, every attempt to remind her and the neighbors that the space legally belonged to him, only fed the narrative she had carefully nurtured, the story of the uptight man who could not share, who cared more about paperwork than about people. She did not need to win the law. She only needed to win perception, and she was doing it with every cheerful smile, every basket of vegetables she distributed in the lobby, every new volunteer who left the roof feeling they had participated in something noble. Ethan's anger was consuming him, and worse, it was isolating him, while Karen grew stronger by feeding off the goodwill she manufactured. One evening, after yet another argument ended with her dismissing his words in front of a group of strangers, Ethan understood with painful clarity that if he kept playing the role she had written for him, he would lose entirely. It was in that moment of resignation that he made an unexpected decision. The next time Karen was on the roof, fussing over her seedlings, Ethan walked up quietly and asked if she needed help. The expression on her face was priceless. Surprise mixed with a flicker of suspicion, quickly masked by her usual brightness. "Of course, Ethan," she said with exaggerated delight. "I knew you'd come around eventually." She handed him a small spade as though he were an apprentice gardener, and together they began to work side by side. He did not mention the lock, or the flyers, or the invasion of his privacy. Instead, he listened as she spoke in her endlessly confident voice about crop rotations, soil quality, and the coming harvest. She had no idea that every word she spoke, every casual boast about how much produce they would gather, was fuel for a plan Ethan had only just begun to form. Over the next several days, he made himself a quiet presence on the roof. He watered plants, he helped move crates, he nodded along when Karen spoke about sustainability and community. To the neighbors, it must have looked as though he had surrendered, that she had won him over to her cause. The atmosphere in the building softened slightly. People smiled more easily when they saw him. Some even congratulated him on finally embracing the project. Karen, too, seemed to relax, growing more talkative, less guarded. She began to share details that she had once hidden. How she had applied for a small environmental grant using photographs of the rooftop. How she had already promised her contacts a certain quantity of produce by the end of the season. How she was planning to host a harvest festival for the community. Ethan absorbed every word, keeping his responses bland and agreeable, but inside he felt a cold calculation taking shape. One evening, while they were alone on the roof, Karen leaned against a crate and laughed lightly, saying, "Do you realize how brilliant this is? I've managed to make a personal rooftop look like a community project, and they're paying me for it. Can you believe how gullible these grant committees are? They see a few photos of kids picking basil and they throw money at me." She did not even notice the way Ethan stiffened at her words. She believed she was untouchable, that he had truly surrendered, and in her arrogance she exposed herself. It was the first real moment of leverage he had gained since the ordeal began. That night Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, carefully researching the grant programs she had mentioned. Sure enough, he found the application guidelines, and among them, a strict requirement that applicants have legal rights to the property where the project was based. Karen had sworn in writing that she had authorization to use the roof, which meant she had lied outright to obtain funding. The realization sent a strange mix of relief and dread through him. Relief, because he finally had something solid that proved she was not simply a misguided neighbor, but someone operating with dishonesty. Dread, because exposing her would not be as easy as presenting facts. Karen's strength was not truth, but persuasion, and if he moved too soon, she would twist his evidence into yet another story of him sabotaging the greater good. He needed to be patient, to build his case carefully, to wait until she had overextended herself. The opportunity came faster than he expected. A week later, Ethan returned home to find a glossy printed invitation taped to every door in the building. Rooftop Harvest Celebration, it announced in bold letters, promising free produce, live music, and refreshments. At the bottom was Karen's name, accompanied by the words, Project Coordinator. She had set the date for 2 months away, by which time she expected the rooftop to be overflowing with vegetables. Ethan stared at the flyer for a long moment, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. He would let her prepare, let her build her audience and her stage, and then he would dismantle the performance in front of everyone she had fooled. Meanwhile, he kept up his active cooperation. He carried soil, he watered plants, he even offered to help with organizing storage for the harvested crops. Karen began to treat him almost like a partner, though never an equal. She still spoke as though the project were hers alone, but she seemed pleased to have him finally on board. In truth, Ethan was watching closely, documenting her boasts and her contradictions, waiting for the moment when all of it could be turned against her. Each evening, when he returned to his apartment, he carefully wrote down the details she had revealed, the amount of money she claimed to have received, the names of the volunteers, the promises she had made to suppliers. It was not enough to simply demand she leave. He wanted to expose her, to strip away the aura of righteousness she had built around herself, and he knew that only by revealing her dishonesty in full view of the very people she manipulated could he undo the damage she had done. As the garden flourished, so did Karen's confidence. She began talking openly about expanding the project, about applying for a second round of funding to build a greenhouse, about inviting local officials to tour the space. Ethan listened to all of it with calm detachment, feeling almost like a shadow moving alongside her. He no longer shouted or argued. Instead, he gave her silence, and in that silence she filled the air with her own words, words that betrayed her. By the time midsummer arrived, Ethan no longer felt powerless. He felt like someone holding a set of scales, watching them tilt slowly under the weight of her arrogance. The midpoint had come. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. The weeks leading up to the so-called harvest celebration were marked by a strange calm on the surface and a growing storm underneath. Ethan kept his mask of reluctant cooperation in place, working alongside Karen when she requested, carrying crates of produce down the narrow stairs, listening quietly while she spoke about her plans for expansion. But beneath his polite nods, he felt the ground shifting. He knew she had lied on her grant applications, and he had begun discreetly gathering more proof, not in the form of dramatic confrontations, but in the careful collection of details that would later reveal themselves like hidden seeds, suddenly sprouting. He photographed the flyers she distributed that referred to the rooftop as shared space. He noted the names of outside volunteers she invited into the building. He recorded in his notes each moment when she claimed ownership of the project despite having no legal right to the land itself. Yet, as he prepared his quiet counterattack, Karen escalated her campaign in ways that revealed how deeply she enjoyed the role she had created for herself. One Saturday morning, Ethan returned from the grocery store to find a row of guests filing into his building, carrying trays of food and bottles of wine. At first, he thought they must be attending a party in one of the apartments, but when he followed them up the stairwell, he realized with a sinking stomach that they were heading to the roof. Karen had invited half a dozen acquaintances for what she called a planning brunch, and by the time Ethan stepped into his own rooftop space, she was presiding over a table draped with a cloth, surrounded by people sipping mimosas and praising the tomatoes ripening on the vine. The sense of violation was acute, not just because strangers were eating on his deck, but because Karen had turned it into a stage, her laughter rising above the clink of glasses as though she were the benevolent host of a grand estate. When Ethan demanded to know why she had brought outsiders, she smiled serenely and said, "Oh, Ethan, don't be so rigid. They're here to support the project. These are potential donors. This is how community grows." The word donors rang in his ears with poisonous clarity, for it confirmed that she was monetizing his space in ways even bolder than he had imagined. The next escalation came in the form of paperwork slipped under his door, a printed notice addressed to residents of the building, announcing that the rooftop garden would soon require reinforcement of its structure to ensure safety for all participants. At the bottom of the notice, in neat type, was an estimate of costs, divided among the units as though it were legitimate building expense. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he read it. Not only had Karen taken over his property, she was attempting to transfer the burden of her project to the entire building, and in doing so she was cementing the illusion that the rooftop was a collective resource. When he confronted her, she gave a patronizing explanation about liability and structural integrity, implying that if he opposed the contribution, he was endangering everyone. "The city can shut projects down if the space isn't deemed safe," she said with a feigned air of concern. "We wouldn't want that, would we?" It was a veiled threat disguised as civic responsibility, and Ethan realized that she was trying to trap him not just socially but financially. His decision to play along began to pay off when Karen overreached once again. In a moment of careless boasting, she told him she had promised a local restaurant owner a steady supply of basil and cherry tomatoes, claiming that farm-to-table branding would make the restaurant trendy. Ethan listened quietly while she outlined how much she had already committed. Then, later that week, he visited the restaurant himself. The owner, a genial man eager to show off his new partnership, confirmed everything. Karen had signed a short, informal agreement, assuring him she had rights to the rooftop garden and could provide produce for at least 3 months. Ethan thanked him politely, his mind racing with the implications. Not only had Karen lied to grant committees, she was now entering into private business deals using property that did not belong to her. This was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. It was fraud, and it gave Ethan the leverage he needed. Meanwhile, the building itself was becoming a colder place for him. Neighbors who once nodded politely now regarded him with suspicion. He overheard whispers when he walked past in the hallway, fragments of conversation that stung more than direct insults. "He's trying to shut her down. Why can't he just let her garden? Karen is doing something wonderful and he's making trouble." The irony was unbearable. He was painted as the aggressor in his own home, while the true aggressor played the role of selfless benefactor. He began to avoid the lobby altogether, leaving and entering at odd hours to escape the stairs, all the while returning to his apartment with a grim sense of determination. He would not endure this forever. As the harvest date approached, Karen grew bolder still. She began speaking of the rooftop as though it were legally hers, telling volunteers that she had secured the space and even hinting that she planned to propose a permanent conversion of the area into a recognized community garden under the city's sustainability program. Ethan knew that was impossible without his consent, but the audacity of the claim chilled him nonetheless. If she continued long enough, perception could harden into reality, and officials who heard only her story might not bother to check the legal truth. He realized with dawning urgency that he had to act before the festival cemented her victory in the eyes of everyone. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat at his desk surrounded by the documents he had gathered: copies of the grant guidelines, photographs of the flyers, notes of Karen's boasts, and the details from the restaurant owner. He stared at the pile, his jaw tight, knowing he was holding the pieces of her downfall but not yet sure how to assemble them. The thought of exposing her filled him with both anticipation and dread. He did not want simply to reclaim his rooftop. He wanted to unravel the story she had woven so tightly around herself, to make her face the truth in front of those she had charmed. The second escalation had reached its peak, Karen believed she was untouchable, but Ethan was preparing the ground for a reversal she could not anticipate. The day of the harvest celebration dawned bright and unseasonably warm, the kind of afternoon that begged for open windows and long shadows stretching across the city skyline. Yet Ethan felt no ease in the air as he climbed the stairwell to his apartment. He could already hear voices drifting down from the rooftop, cheerful and animated, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the strum of a guitar. When he finally reached the top, the sight before him was surreal. His once quiet terrace had been transformed into a festival ground, with folding tables covered in bowls of tomatoes, baskets of herbs, and pitchers of lemonade. Strings of lights ran across the railings, swaying in the breeze, and nearly 24 people filled the space, laughing, eating, congratulating Karen for her vision. She stood in the center like a queen, accepting their praise with the gracious smile of someone who believed she had already won. For a moment, Ethan felt the old helplessness tug at him, the sense that he was the lone intruder at his own home. But then he remembered the papers tucked into the folder under his arm, the documents he had gathered with such care over the past weeks, and a calmness steadied him. He moved through the crowd quietly until he reached one of the tables, where Karen was arranging a display of basil tied neatly with twine. "Ethan," she exclaimed with exaggerated delight, "you came. I wasn't sure you'd be ready to celebrate with us, but isn't it wonderful to see everyone together?" She gestured broadly at the guests, who smiled and raised their glasses as though to include him in the collective glow. Ethan did not return the smile. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and opened it with deliberate slowness, spreading the papers out for anyone nearby to see. Conversations faltered, the strumming of the guitar stopped, and a hush fell over the group as he began to speak. His voice was even, not loud, but clear enough to carry across the roof. He explained that the rooftop was legally his property alone, citing the deed and the exact language from the building records. He pointed to the grant guidelines that required proof of ownership, and revealed that Karen had submitted false claims to obtain funding. He described her agreement with the restaurant, which relied on produce grown on property she did not own and had no authority to promise. He laid each piece of evidence before them like stones building a wall, step by step stripping away the story she had told. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice sharp with sudden panic, insisting that Ethan was twisting her words, that the garden was for everyone, that he was only jealous of her success. But the calm certainty of the documents spoke louder than her protests, and the shift in the crowd was palpable. The same neighbors who had smiled at her so adoringly now glanced at one another with doubt, whispering in low voices. One woman asked hesitantly whether Karen had really lied on her grant application. Another frowned at the mention of the restaurant deal, realizing that what she had believed was a selfless project might have been a business scheme. Ethan did not raise his voice or gloat. He simply continued, laying out the evidence until Karen's interruptions grew shriller. Her smile faltered, and finally, in a fit of frustration, she blurted out the very words that sealed her downfall. "Of course, I claimed it as mine. How else do you think we would have gotten the money? Do you think anyone cares whose roof it is, as long as the garden looks good?" The silence that followed was heavy and final, broken only by the shuffle of feet as several guests gathered their belongings and muttered excuses to leave. In the space of a few minutes the celebration collapsed, the lights still swaying, but the laughter gone. Karen stood frozen, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling as though she could pull her words back into her mouth. Ethan collected his papers, closed the folder, and looked at her one last time. "You wanted people," he said quietly. "But people see through lies, sooner or later." Then he turned and walked down the stairwell, leaving her to face the hollowing silence of a party that had turned into a reckoning. For the first time in months, Ethan felt that the balance had shifted. The rooftop was no longer her stage but his again, reclaimed not with shouting or fists but with truth laid bare in front of those she had deceived. And though he knew the battle was not finished, he had reached the moment where the tide turned, the point where her power began to crumble. The days following the collapse of the harvest celebration carried with them a strange quiet that felt heavier than noise. Ethan noticed it first in the hallways of the building, where neighbors who once eyed him with suspicion now avoided eye contact altogether, not out of hostility, but out of embarrassment. They had believed Karen's story so completely that to face him now meant acknowledging how easily they had been swayed. A few slipped brief notes of apology under his door, handwritten messages that spoke of misunderstanding and regret, but Ethan did not linger on them. He had not fought this battle for their approval, and the satisfaction of reclaiming what was his did not require their absolution. The rooftop itself bore the scars of the ordeal: abandoned crates of soil, half-wilted plants, and strings of lights that swayed in the wind with no one left to admire them. Ethan spent an entire weekend clearing it all away, dismantling the trellises, carrying the heavy boxes down one by one, scrubbing the decking until the smell of earth faded, and the space once again resembled the sanctuary he had built. Each act of removal felt like lifting a weight from his shoulders, as though he were exorcising not only the garden but the story that had threatened to consume his life. Karen, meanwhile, was no longer the queen of the building but a shadow slipping through it. Rumors spread quickly after her outburst, and though Ethan did not contribute to them, he heard enough to know that her grant committee had already begun investigating her claims, that the restaurant had quietly ended its agreement, and that several neighbors who once praised her now resented her for dragging them into deception. She still passed him occasionally in the lobby, her expression tight and brittle, but the power she once wielded with a smile and a few clever words was gone. Ethan did not gloat when their eyes met. He simply nodded and moved on, secure in the knowledge that she could no longer twist the truth into something that served her. When the last of the soil was gone and the rooftop stood bare again, Ethan brought up 2 chairs and a small table, restoring the simple arrangement he had once loved. One evening, as the sun set and the city glowed beneath him, he sat with a glass of wine and listened to the distant hum of traffic, feeling for the first time in months that the space had truly belonged to him again. The battle with Karen had not only reclaimed his property, but had reminded him that boundaries mattered, that truth could be buried beneath layers of performance but would surface eventually if one had the patience to uncover it. The rooftop was quiet. No voices, no arguments, no false celebrations, only the steady rhythm of the city beyond. For Ethan, it was enough. Not victory in the grand sense, but the quiet return of peace hard won.